In the winter of 1871, long after the last footsteps had faded from the corridors of Saxony's learned institutions, a clerk closed a ledger that was never meant to be read again. Its pages were dense with numbers, initials, and clinical observations written in careful ink. There were no names, only ages. 7, 9, 11. Alongside them were notes that spoke in the language of progress and improvement, but hinted at something far more disturbing beneath the surface. What those pages described was not a foreign atrocity or the work of a secret cult hiding on the fringes of society. It was the quiet, methodical work of a respected organization, operating in plain sight, convinced that what it was doing was not only acceptable, but necessary. This is not a story of monsters lurking in shadows. It is a story of men in suits, of lecture halls filled with applause, of journals praised for their rigor and intelligence. It is the story of a society that believed it stood at the cutting edge of human advancement, at a moment when science promised to unlock the secrets of the body, the mind, and even heredity itself. And in that belief, it crossed a line so profound that even generations later, its implications remained deeply unsettling. The year was 1871. Germany had just unified, and Saxony stood proudly among its intellectual heartlands. This was an age intoxicated by progress. Railways stitched cities together, factories hummed with productivity, and science was no longer content to observe nature, it sought to master it. Diseases that had once been blamed on divine punishment were now being dissected under microscopes. Human behavior, once explained by theology, was being measured, categorized, and theorized. The future, many believed, could be engineered. But progress has always carried a shadow. And in Saxony, that shadow fell upon the most vulnerable members of society, children. They were not dragged screaming from their homes in the dead of night. There were no chains, no public spectacles of cruelty. Instead, there were forms, signatures, and institutional approvals. Children entered schools, clinics, and charitable homes believing they were being cared for. Their parents, if they had parents, were told these places offered discipline, education, and opportunity. What they could not see was how these children were being observed, tested, and altered. How their pain was recorded not as suffering, but as data. At the center of this story is a society whose name appears repeatedly in archival fragments, its full title changing over the years, its purpose carefully worded to sound benevolent. On paper, it existed to improve child welfare, public health, and the future strength of the nation. Its members were doctors, educators, administrators, men whose opinions carried weight, whose recommendations shaped policy. They attended conferences, published papers, and advised the state. To question them was to question science itself. And yet, hidden within their work was a belief that would justify the unthinkable, that some lives were more valuable as experiments than as individuals. Children, they argued, were uniquely adaptable. Their bodies could endure. Their minds could be shaped. If progress required sacrifice, then surely it was better made early, before flaws became fixed. In an era obsessed with improvement, with correcting weakness and eliminating degeneracy, this logic spread quietly and efficiently. What began as observation blurred into intervention. What was once care became control. For decades, these practices remained largely invisible. Records were sealed, euphemisms carefully chosen. Deaths were attributed to natural causes. Behavioral changes were labeled developmental phases. The children themselves, lacking status or voice, disappeared into adulthood, or into graves, without leaving testimony behind. History moved on, celebrating breakthroughs and innovations, never asking who had paid the price. It is only through fragments, marginal notes, internal correspondence, and rare dissenting letters, that the outline of what happened begins to emerge. And when it does, it raises questions that are deeply uncomfortable. Not just about the past, but about the nature of authority, ethics, and how easily morality can be reshaped when wrapped in the language of necessity. This story matters not because it is unique, but because it is familiar in ways we would rather not admit. Again and again, history shows us that when institutions decide they are acting for the greater good, individual suffering becomes negotiable. The victims are often those least able to resist, and the perpetrators rarely see themselves as cruel. They see themselves as rational, enlightened, correct. As we move deeper into this story, we will encounter ideas that feel disturbingly modern, debates about heredity, behavior, and optimization, arguments about whether society has the right to intervene in childhood development, claims that temporary suffering can produce long-term benefit. These ideas did not vanish with the 19th century. They evolved. The children at the center of this story were not symbols or statistics. They were sons and daughters, students and patients, each with fears, hopes, and lives interrupted by forces they could not understand. Their names may be lost, but their experiences echo in the ethical frameworks that govern science today, and in the moments when those frameworks fail. This is an investigation into how a society convinced itself that experimenting on its own children was not an atrocity, but a duty. Into how silence can be manufactured, and memory erased. And into what happens when progress is pursued without compassion. Because once we understand how easily this happened in Saxony in 1871, we are forced to confront a far more unsettling question. If we had been there, educated, respected, convinced of our good intentions, would we have done any different? In order to understand how such a society could exist, and why its actions were not immediately condemned, it is necessary to step back into the world of Saxony in 1871. This was not a backward province lost in superstition and ignorance. Quite the opposite. Saxony was one of the most intellectually vibrant regions of the newly unified German Empire. Its cities were dense with printing presses, universities, technical schools, and medical academies. Leipzig and Dresden in particular were celebrated across Europe for their contributions to philosophy, science, and education. Knowledge was currency, and those who possessed it held immense authority. Germany's unification earlier that same year had sparked a surge of national pride. There was a widespread belief that the nation had entered a new historical phase, one defined by strength, order, and scientific superiority. Progress was no longer just a hope, it was an expectation. The state invested heavily in research, infrastructure, and education, viewing them as tools to secure Germany's future among Europe's great powers. In this atmosphere, science was elevated almost to a civic religion. Laboratories replaced chapels as places where truth was revealed, and the men who worked within them were treated as interpreters of reality itself. Medicine, in particular, was undergoing a profound transformation. The old humoral theories were being abandoned in favor of anatomy, pathology, and emerging bacteriological ideas. Doctors were no longer simply healers, they were investigators of the human machine. The body became something that could be measured, dissected, and improved. Illness was increasingly framed not as a personal misfortune, but as a problem to be solved in the interest of society as a whole. This shift carried profound consequences, especially for those whose bodies or behaviors were deemed abnormal. Children occupied a strange and often contradictory place in this worldview. On one hand, they were celebrated as the future of the nation, symbols of hope, continuity, and potential. On the other, they were seen as incomplete beings, still forming, still correctable. Childhood was understood not as a protected stage of life, but as a critical window during which intervention was both possible and desirable. If weakness, deviance, or illness could be identified early, it could be addressed before it threatened the social body. This thinking was reinforced by rigid class divisions. The children of educated, affluent families were viewed as investments to be nurtured carefully. The children of the poor, however, were often perceived as risks. Poverty itself was increasingly medicalized, described in terms of inherited weakness, moral deficiency, or biological inferiority. A child born into hardship was not simply unlucky, he or she was suspected of carrying traits that might spread disorder if left unchecked. Institutions such as orphanages, reform schools, and charitable homes became spaces where these fears could be managed, and where oversight was minimal. At the same time, Saxony was deeply bureaucratic. Everything from education to healthcare operated through layers of administration. Reports were filed, inspections conducted, and standards enforced. But this bureaucracy did not necessarily protect the vulnerable. Instead, it often diffused responsibility. When harm occurred, it was difficult to pinpoint who was accountable. Decisions were made collectively, signed off by committees, justified by policy. Cruelty did not need to be personal. It could be procedural. Scientific societies flourished within this environment. These were formal organizations that brought together experts from various fields to exchange ideas, conduct research, and advise the state. Membership was prestigious, signaling not only expertise but moral standing. To belong to such a society was to be recognized as someone working for the public good. Their meetings were orderly, their publications dense and authoritative. Behind this respectability, however, they also served as echo chambers, reinforcing shared assumptions and discouraging dissent. One of the most powerful assumptions of the era was that society had the right, perhaps even the obligation, to intervene in the lives of individuals for the sake of collective improvement. This belief did not arise in a vacuum. It was shaped by industrialization, urban overcrowding, and fears of social decay. Crime, illness, and poverty were not just problems, they were threats to national strength. And threats, once identified, had to be neutralized. Within this logic, children became a focal point. They were seen as raw material. If shaped correctly, they could become productive citizens. If not, they might become burdens. The line between education and experimentation was thin, and often blurred intentionally. New teaching methods, dietary regimens, medical treatments, and behavioral controls were tested in institutional settings with little oversight. Failure was reframed as learning. Suffering was reframed as necessary discomfort. Religion, though still influential, was increasingly reinterpreted through this lens of progress. Moral duty was no longer defined solely by compassion or mercy, but by contribution to societal improvement. Helping the weak was admirable, but correcting them was considered more responsible. In some circles, suffering was even seen as instructive, a means of discipline or purification. This fusion of moral certainty and scientific ambition created a climate in which extreme measures could be rationalized with alarming ease. It is also important to recognize what was missing from this world, the concept of informed consent as we understand it today. Children were considered incapable of making meaningful decisions about their own lives. Parents, particularly poor or marginalized ones, had limited power to refuse institutional authority. When experts spoke, their words carried the weight of inevitability. To resist was to appear ignorant, irresponsible, or even dangerous. Newspapers of the time praised advancements in child welfare, education reform, and medical innovation. Reports emphasized success stories and statistical improvements. Rarely did they investigate individual experiences. When they did, those stories were often framed as tragic exceptions rather than systemic issues. Public trust in institutions remained largely intact, supported by a culture that equated order with virtue and expertise with benevolence. Against this backdrop, the society at the center of this story did not appear radical. It appeared logical. Its methods, though severe, were presented as thoughtful and controlled. Its goals aligned with national priorities. And its subjects, children drawn from the least powerful segments of society, were unlikely to be missed, believed, or defended. Understanding Saxony in 1871 means understanding a place where good intentions and harmful outcomes were not seen as contradictions, where progress was measured in charts and outcomes, not in individual pain, where authority was trusted, and questioning it was rare. It was a world primed for abuse not because it lacked morality, but because it believed its morality was beyond question. Only later, when fragments of the truth began to surface, would it become clear how deeply this environment had failed those it claimed to protect. And by then, the systems that allowed it had already moved on, leaving behind a silence that would take generations to break. The society at the center of this story did not announce itself as radical, dangerous, or experimental. On paper, it appeared almost mundane. Its name, which shifted slightly over the years through mergers and rechartering, was deliberately constructed to evoke responsibility, care, and national improvement. Words like advancement, welfare, scientific study, and education appeared frequently in its official descriptions. To an outside observer in 1871, it would have seemed like just another learned association, one of many operating across Saxony, dedicated to solving the social problems of a rapidly modernizing world. Its members were men of standing. University professors, senior physicians, school inspectors, and civil administrators filled its ranks. Many held multiple positions at once, moving easily between hospitals, lecture halls, and government offices. Their authority did not come from secrecy, but from visibility. They published papers. They gave public lectures. Their names appeared in newspapers and academic journals. These were men trusted with shaping policy, advising ministries, and defining what counted as knowledge itself. The society met regularly in formal settings, lecture rooms with high ceilings, long wooden tables, and shelves lined with volumes of medical and philosophical texts. Meetings followed strict procedures. Minutes were recorded carefully. Proposals were introduced, debated, and voted upon. Everything about the structure conveyed order and seriousness. This was not chaos masquerading as science. It was discipline. Yet within this discipline existed a chilling flexibility of ethics. The society's internal documents reveal a pattern of language that is striking in its cold precision. Children were rarely referred to as children. Instead, they were cases, subjects, or material. Individual identities dissolved into categories: developmental delay, behavioral irregularity, hereditary weakness, moral deficiency. Once classified, a child ceased to be a person in need of care and became a problem to be studied. Publicly, the society emphasized prevention. It argued that early intervention could reduce crime, illness, and dependency later in life. This was a persuasive argument in a society anxious about urbanization and social disorder. The idea that one could identify and correct flaws early appealed to both economic efficiency and moral responsibility. But behind closed doors, prevention became experimentation. What made the society particularly dangerous was not that it rejected morality, but that it redefined it. Members genuinely believed they were acting in the best interests of society. Many even believed they were acting in the best interests of the children themselves. Pain, discomfort, and fear were reframed as temporary costs for long-term benefit. If a child suffered now but society benefited later, that suffering could be justified. If some children did not survive, their deaths could be recorded as unfortunate but informative outcomes. There was little sense that these children had inherent rights independent of social usefulness. Rights, in this worldview, were conditional. They were earned through conformity, productivity, and perceived potential. Children who failed to meet these standards, especially those born into poverty or institutional care, were seen as already compromised. Experimentation, therefore, was not viewed as exploitation, but as an opportunity to extract value where little was expected. The society's power was amplified by its connections. Hospitals provided access to young patients. Schools supplied behavioral data. Orphanages and charitable institutions acted as steady pipelines of children who lacked advocates. Because the society's members often held leadership roles in these institutions, there was no need for coercion in the traditional sense. Consent was assumed, implied, or bypassed entirely through administrative authority. Language played a crucial role in maintaining the system. Reports spoke of adjustments rather than punishments, procedures rather than experiments, observations rather than surveillance. Suffering was translated into statistics. Fear became noncompliance. Deaths were anomalies to be analyzed rather than tragedies to be mourned. By stripping experiences of emotional content, the society insulated itself from moral reckoning. Internally, dissent was rare but not entirely absent. A handful of letters and marginal notes suggest that some members expressed unease. They questioned whether certain methods went too far, whether outcomes justify the means. But these voices were quickly absorbed or silenced, not through threats, but through procedure. Concerns were referred to committees. Committees delayed responses. Delays became inaction. In a system designed to move slowly and collectively, urgency dissolved. What is perhaps most disturbing is how ordinary all of this was. There were no secret rituals, no dramatic declarations of superiority. Meetings ended with polite applause. Members returned home to families, dinners, and conversations about culture and politics. The same hands that signed off on invasive procedures also held children of their own. The separation between their children and those children was rarely acknowledged, but always present. The society understood the importance of appearances. Public-facing documents emphasized success stories, cases where children showed improvement, adaptation, or increased discipline. Failures were either excluded or reframed as necessary learning steps. The absence of external oversight allowed the society to define its own metrics of success. As long as it could demonstrate progress on paper, its methods remained unquestioned. Over time, the society's reputation grew. Its recommendations influenced policy. Its research informed educational and medical practices beyond Saxony. This success reinforced its confidence. If results were being adopted elsewhere, surely the methods were sound. Ethical concerns were dismissed as emotional resistance to hard truths. Progress, they believed, required courage, the courage to act where others hesitated. Yet beneath this confidence was a profound blindness. The society rarely asked what it meant to treat children as means rather than ends. It did not consider how power distorted its judgments, or how easily authority could replace empathy. The very structure that made it efficient also made it incapable of self-correction. By embedding experimentation within institutions of care, the society ensured that its actions would be remembered, if at all, as part of ordinary administration. No single document announced the beginning of abuse. No single vote marked a moral collapse. Instead, there was a gradual normalization of harm, justified step by step, until it became indistinguishable from routine practice. This is how the society functioned, not as a rogue organization operating outside the law, but as a respected body operating comfortably within it. Its danger lay precisely in that respectability, because when cruelty wears the mask of progress, it rarely needs to hide. The children who became the focus of the society's work did not arrive as volunteers, nor were they presented as participants in any meaningful sense. They arrived as files, as names written in ledgers, sometimes misspelled, sometimes reduced to initials. Many had already been passed through several institutions before reaching the society's reach, born into poverty, placed into orphanages, transferred to reform schools, or admitted to hospitals where their presence was more administrative than personal. By the time they were selected, they had already learned that adults in authority asked questions that did not require honest answers. Most of these children came from the margins of Saxon society. Orphans were the most common, particularly those whose parents had died of disease, industrial accidents, or war-related hardships. Without family protection, they belonged to the state by default. Others were taken from families deemed unfit, homes labeled immoral, unstable, or incapable of proper upbringing. In such cases, removal was framed as rescue. The language of care concealed the reality of permanent separation. Some children were chosen because of physical conditions, disabilities, chronic illnesses, developmental delays, or visible deformities drew the attention of physicians eager to study variation. These children were described in medical terms long before they were described as people. Measurements were taken. Behaviors were noted. Their bodies became maps of curiosity. In a society obsessed with classification, difference was irresistible. Behavioral labeling was equally powerful. Children who disobeyed, struggled in school, or failed to conform were quickly categorized as problematic. Terms like weak-willed, impulsive, or morally unstable appear repeatedly in internal records. Such labels followed them from one institution to another, shaping how they were treated and what was expected of them. Once a child was marked as defective in character, harsh methods could be justified as corrective. The process of selection was methodical. Committees reviewed reports submitted by schools, orphanages, and hospitals. These reports rarely included the child's own voice. Instead, they summarized performance, obedience, health, and perceived potential. A child who failed to improve under standard discipline was considered an ideal candidate for more intensive methods. Resistance was not a warning sign, it was an invitation. Upon arrival, children were subjected to intake procedures that stripped away individuality. Clothing was replaced with institutional garments. Personal belongings were catalogued or discarded. Names were often replaced with numbers in daily records. This was not simply administrative efficiency, it was psychological distancing. It allowed staff to manage children as groups rather than individuals, reducing empathy and increasing control. Daily life for these children was tightly regulated. Schedules dictated when they woke, ate, worked, studied, and slept. Deviations were noted. Compliance was rewarded. Hesitation was corrected. The children quickly learned that their bodies and behaviors were under constant observation. Even silence was interpreted. A withdrawn child might be labeled unresponsive. An anxious one, unstable. There was no neutral state. What made this environment particularly devastating was the absence of clear explanations. Children were rarely told why they were there or what was expected of them beyond obedience. Procedures were introduced without consent or context. Painful treatments were framed as necessary, even beneficial, though the children had no way to understand how. Fear became routine, and uncertainty a constant companion. Some children tried to resist in small ways, refusing food, feigning illness, or withdrawing into themselves. Others attempted compliance, hoping obedience would bring relief. But the system was not designed to reward humanity. It was designed to produce data. Improvement was defined narrowly, often in terms of measurable outcomes rather than well-being. A child who became quieter might be labeled successful, even if that silence was the result of despair. Relationships among the children were discouraged or closely monitored. Attachment was seen as a distraction, potentially interfering with observation. Isolation made children easier to manage and less likely to share experiences. Without shared language or trust, collective resistance was impossible. Each child experienced the institution alone, even when surrounded by others. The most disturbing aspect of this process was how quickly children were rendered invisible. Once classified and absorbed into the system, they ceased to exist as individuals in any public sense. Families who inquired were given vague reassurances. Records were sanitized. Transfers between institutions erased continuity, making it difficult to trace what had happened to any one child over time. If a child died, the explanation was often brief and technical. Yet these children were not passive objects. They felt fear, confusion, hope, and longing. Some kept small rituals, counting days, whispering prayers, clinging to fragments of memory from before their confinement. Others internalized the language used to describe them, coming to believe they were broken or unworthy. The psychological damage inflicted was often deeper than the physical. The society did not see this damage, or if it did not recognize it as harm. Emotional suffering was not part of its metrics. Tears did not appear in reports. Nightmares were not measured. What could not be quantified was dismissed as irrelevant. This blindness allowed cruelty to persist without acknowledgement. Over time, many of these children disappeared from the records altogether. Some aged out of the system, released into society with little support and a lifetime of trauma. Others were transferred, lost in bureaucratic transitions. A number died, their lives summarized in a single line of text. No funerals, no memorials, no reckoning. What remains is a haunting absence. We know these children existed because of the documents that reduced them. We know they suffered because of the methods recorded with such detachment. But their voices are largely gone, erased by a system that never intended to preserve them. By examining who these children were and how they were chosen, it becomes clear that the society's cruelty was not random. It followed lines of power, class, and vulnerability. It targeted those least able to resist and least likely to be believed. And in doing so, it revealed a truth that echoes far beyond Saxony in 1871. When a society decides that some children matter less than others, it opens the door to horrors carried out in the name of progress. What the society called experimentation rarely began with anything dramatic. There were no sudden restraints, no immediate invasions of the body. Instead, the process unfolded gradually, almost politely, disguised as routine care. Observation came first. Children were watched as they ate, slept, studied, and interacted. Every gesture was noted. How long they hesitated before answering a question. How they reacted to authority. Whether they cried easily, laughed too little, or showed signs of defiance. These early stages allowed the society to convince itself that it understood the child before intervening. In reality, it was preparing a justification. Once a child had been sufficiently documented, the next phase began, controlled alteration. Diets were modified, sometimes drastically. Certain children were placed on restricted nutritional regimens designed to test theories about growth, temperament, and obedience. Hunger was framed as discipline. Weight loss was described as adjustment. Complaints were recorded not as distress, but as resistance. The assumption was simple and chilling. If the body changed, the mind would follow. Medical procedures followed similar logic. Treatments were administered not because they were proven to help, but because they produced observable effects. Early pharmaceuticals, some barely tested on adults, were given to children to measure tolerance and behavioral change. Dosages were adjusted incrementally, reactions carefully logged. Side effects were not reasons to stop, they were reasons to observe more closely. Pain became information. Invasive procedures were justified through language that emphasized necessity and advancement. Blood was drawn repeatedly, sometimes excessively, to track internal changes. Reflexes were tested through discomfort. Sensory deprivation and overstimulation were used to study psychological response. In some cases, children were deliberately exposed to illness under controlled conditions, the rationale being that understanding vulnerability required inducing it. Survival was considered success. Death was considered data. Perhaps the most insidious experiments were behavioral. These required no instruments, only authority. Children were subjected to rigid conditioning routines designed to suppress unwanted traits and reinforce compliance. Rewards were calculated. Punishments were standardized. Silence, isolation, and repetition were used to break habits deemed undesirable. Emotional expression was discouraged, sometimes explicitly punished. The goal was not happiness or health, but predictability. What made these methods especially cruel was their adaptability. If a child did not respond as expected, the procedure was not questioned, the child was. Failure was attributed to deeper defect, justifying harsher intervention. In this way, experimentation escalated naturally, each step reinforcing the belief that more control was required. The society prided itself on documentation. Every experiment generated reports filled with tables, comparisons, and conclusions. But these documents reveal a striking absence: empathy. Children are described as units within a sample, their experiences flattened into outcomes. A child who screamed during a procedure might be noted as exhibiting heightened sensitivity. One who stopped speaking could be described as stabilized. The language converted suffering into success. There was also an unsettling fascination with heredity. Members of the society believed that traits such as obedience, intelligence, and morality could be traced through bloodlines. Children from certain backgrounds were therefore considered ideal subjects for testing theories about inherited weakness or resilience. If a child failed to improve, it was seen as confirmation of hereditary limitation rather than evidence of harm. This circular logic made the experiments self-validating. Age offered no protection. Younger children were often preferred precisely because they were seen as more malleable. Their memories, it was assumed, would fade. Their bodies would adapt. This belief allowed the society to justify procedures that would have been unthinkable if performed on adults. Childhood, instead of being a shield, became an excuse. Staff members who carried out these experiments were rarely sadistic in the conventional sense. Many saw themselves as professionals doing difficult but necessary work. Emotional distance was encouraged. Attachment was considered unscientific. Compassion, when it interfered with protocol, was framed as weakness. Over time, routine dulled any remaining discomfort. What once might have seemed shocking became normal. Yet cracks appear even in the society's own records. Notes about unexpected deaths. References to children who deteriorated rapidly. Mentions of unfavorable outcomes that required re-evaluation, not of methods, but of subjects. There are moments where the language hesitates, where uncertainty flickers briefly before being buried under conclusions and recommendations. The children, meanwhile, experience these experiments not as structured inquiries, but as an unpredictable series of violations. They did not know which rule would change next, which procedure would be introduced, or how long discomfort would last. The lack of explanation magnified fear. Trust in adults eroded. For some, compliance became survival. For others, withdrawal was the only refuge. Sleep disturbances were common, though rarely acknowledged. Nighttime offered no relief. Dreams replayed the day's procedures, while anticipation of the next day created constant anxiety. Some children became hypervigilant, attuned to every change in tone or routine. Others dissociated, retreating inward. These psychological responses were sometimes noted, but never interpreted as harm. Instead, they were folded into theories about temperament and development. One of the most disturbing aspects of these experiments was how easily they were expanded. A procedure developed for one purpose might be applied broadly once it produced measurable effects. Success in one institution led to adoption in another. The society functioned as a clearinghouse for methods, refining and distributing techniques with little regard for cumulative impact on individual lives. There was no endpoint clearly defined. Experiments did not conclude when a child improved, only when data collection was deemed sufficient. Some children were subjected to repeated cycles of intervention, each justified by the previous one's incomplete results. Childhood became an extended trial, with no guarantee of release. From the society's perspective, these experiments represented progress. They produced papers, recommendations, and influence. From the children's perspective, they represented a world where pain was routine and mercy absent. The tragedy lies not only in what was done, but in how thoroughly it was rationalized. Science without restraint became cruelty without conscience. By the time questions began to surface, about rising mortality, about long-term damage, the experiments had already shaped institutional practice. They were no longer extraordinary measures. They were standard procedure. And when harm becomes standard, it is no longer seen as harm at all. This was science without mercy, not because its practitioners sought suffering, but because they learned to stop seeing it. To understand how the society was able to continue its work without collapsing under moral scrutiny, one must look beyond laboratories and institutions and examine the beliefs that surrounded and protected it. Science alone did not justify the experiments. It was reinforced by faith, philosophy, and a powerful moral narrative that reframed cruelty as responsibility. In Saxony in 1871, ethics were not absent. They were simply aligned in a way that favored authority over compassion. Religion still played a central role in everyday life, but it had begun to change its posture toward science. Rather than opposing it, many religious leaders sought to integrate scientific progress into their understanding of moral duty. Suffering, long framed as a test of faith or a path to spiritual refinement, was now interpreted as meaningful when it served a higher purpose. If hardship strengthened character, then controlled hardship could be defended as guidance rather than harm. Some clergy openly supported institutional discipline, especially for children deemed wayward or weak. Sermons emphasized obedience, correction, and sacrifice. A child who suffered quietly was praised for endurance. One who resisted was seen as morally flawed. This theology did not require explicit endorsement of experimentation to be effective. It merely created a cultural backdrop in which suffering was normalized and questioning authority discouraged. The society drew heavily from this moral atmosphere. Its members did not describe themselves as violators of ethical norms, but as guardians of order. They believed that allowing weakness to persist unchecked was itself immoral. In their view, intervention, even painful intervention, was an act of courage. To do nothing was to condemn society to decay. Nationalism further reinforced this logic. The newly unified German state was obsessed with strength, discipline, and unity. Children were increasingly viewed not just as individuals, but as future citizens whose bodies and minds would determine the fate of the nation. Weakness was no longer merely personal. It was political. A child who failed to conform represented a future burden, a potential drain on productivity and stability. Within this framework, moral worth became conditional. A child's value was tied to potential usefulness. Those who demonstrated promise were nurtured. Those who did not were corrected. And those deemed incapable of correction were studied. The idea that every child possessed inherent dignity, regardless of outcome, struggled to survive in a culture that measured worth in contribution. Philosophical currents of the time also played a role. Enlightenment thinking had emphasized reason, order, and the perfectibility of humanity. By the late 19th century, these ideas had evolved into more rigid systems of classification. Human traits were no longer simply observed, they were ranked. Intelligence, morality, and behavior were placed on scales. Once ranked, inequality could be justified as natural rather than constructed. This ranking mindset allowed the society to believe it was merely revealing truths, not creating harm. If a child suffered under experimentation, it was because the child's constitution was flawed. The experiment did not cause weakness, it exposed it. This inversion of responsibility was crucial. It absolved practitioners of guilt and placed blame squarely on the subject. Moral language was carefully deployed to maintain this illusion. Reports spoke of necessary correction, beneficial discipline, and constructive pressure. Pain was described as momentary. Fear was framed as transitional. Long-term damage was rarely acknowledged, and when it was attributed to pre-existing conditions. The society convinced itself that it was responding to reality, not shaping it. Within the institutions themselves, a hierarchy of obedience mirrored these beliefs. Staff were expected to follow protocols without question. Doubt was framed as emotional interference. Compassion, when it conflicted with procedure, was discouraged. Younger staff members learned quickly that advancement depended on compliance. Moral discomfort was something to be overcome, not explored. For children, this moral system was incomprehensible. They were told that obedience was good, that discomfort was temporary, that authority knew best. When they cried, they were reminded of duty. When they resisted, they were accused of ingratitude. The language used around them suggested that their suffering was not only acceptable, but meaningful. Over time, some internalized this message, believing their pain was deserved. This is one of the most devastating legacies of the society's work, not just the physical and psychological harm inflicted, but the moral confusion instilled. Children learned that care could coexist with cruelty, that authority could harm while claiming virtue. These lessons did not vanish when they left the institution. They shape how survivors understood power, trust, and self-worth for the rest of their lives. Even outside the institutions, public morality rarely challenged what was happening. The society's work was abstract to most citizens, filtered through reports of improvement and progress. There were no graphic accounts, no public testimonies. The victims were invisible. Without visible suffering, outrage could not form. Silence became complicity. It is tempting to imagine that someone, somewhere, must have known this was wrong. And undoubtedly, some did. But knowing something feels wrong is not the same as being able to stop it. The combined weight of religious justification, scientific authority, and national purpose made resistance seem not only futile, but dangerous. To oppose the society was to oppose progress, order, and morality itself. In this environment, cruelty did not need to be defended aggressively. It simply needed to be framed correctly. And the frame was powerful enough to transform suffering into virtue, obedience into morality, and experimentation into duty. This moral architecture did more than protect the society, it ensured its longevity. By embedding harm within systems of belief, it made that harm invisible to those who benefited from a system. And when morality is redefined to serve power, the most vulnerable always pay the price. By the time cracks began to appear, when deaths accumulated, when outcomes failed to match promises, the moral foundation had already done its work. Doubt could be dismissed as misunderstanding. Suffering could be reframed as necessary. And the children, once again, were left without defenders. What makes this chapter so disturbing is not the absence of ethics, but their presence. These experiments were not carried out in moral chaos. They were carried out in moral certainty. And history has shown, again and again, that certainty is far more dangerous than doubt. For years, the society operated within a closed circuit of authority, documentation, and self-justification. Its work moved forward quietly, buffered by reputation and institutional loyalty. But no system built on silence remains perfectly sealed. Small disturbances began to ripple through the carefully maintained order, subtle at first, easy to dismiss. These were not dramatic rebellions or public scandals. They were inconsistencies, numbers that did not align, absences that were noticed too late, questions that lingered just long enough to cause discomfort. The earliest cracks appeared in mortality records. A few children died under circumstances that could not be easily explained away as natural progression of illness. Internal notes referred to unexpected deterioration or unanticipated complications. These phrases appeared more frequently than before. At first, they were treated as statistical noise, unfortunate but inevitable in a population already labeled vulnerable. But as the deaths accumulated, patterns began to form. Some staff members noticed that children subjected to more intensive procedures were declining faster than expected. Weight loss was severe. Infections lingered. Recovery times lengthened. In private correspondence, a small number of physicians expressed concern that interventions might be weakening rather than strengthening their subjects. These concerns were cautiously worded, framed as technical questions rather than moral objections. Even doubt had to speak the language of science to be tolerated. Disappearance was another issue. Children transferred between institutions sometimes vanished from the record entirely. Files ended abruptly. Names stopped appearing in reports. When inquiries were made, responses were vague. A child might have been relocated, released, or deceased, but documentation was incomplete. In a system built on paperwork, these gaps were unsettling. They suggested either negligence or intentional erasure. Outside the institutions, families began asking questions. Parents who had been told their children were receiving care noticed changes during rare visits. Children appeared withdrawn, fearful, or physically altered. Some refused to speak about their experiences. Others spoke in fragmented, confusing ways that were easy to dismiss as imagination or emotional instability. Complaints were filed, but they rarely traveled far. Institutions reassured families with technical explanations and appeals to authority. Within the society, these external pressures were met with defensiveness rather than reflection. Leadership emphasized the importance of staying the course. They warned that abandoning methods prematurely would undermine years of work. Concerns were reframed as misunderstandings caused by emotional reactions. The narrative was clear. Discomfort was temporary, but progress was permanent. Still, doubt crept in. Younger members of the society, less invested in its founding assumptions, began to question whether the data truly supported the conclusions being drawn. Some noticed that success metrics were shifting, standards quietly adjusted to ensure positive outcomes. Improvement was redefined to match results rather than the other way around. This manipulation was subtle, but it signaled insecurity. There were also whispers of dissent from outside the society. Rival academics questioned the ethics of certain child-focused studies, though they rarely named institutions directly. Journal articles hinted at concerns about overreach, about the dangers of treating development as a mechanical process. These critiques were careful, often buried in footnotes, but they circulated. The society responded by tightening control over information, limiting what was shared publicly. One particularly troubling development was the rise in psychological collapse among children. Reports began mentioning extreme withdrawal, refusal to eat, and episodes described as hysteria. These were interpreted as evidence of pre-existing weakness rather than consequences of treatment. Children who broke under pressure were cited as examples of why stricter methods were necessary. The logic fed on itself. Internally, the society created review committees to address concerns. On the surface, this appeared responsible. In practice, these committees functioned as containment mechanisms. They reviewed complaints slowly, filtered language, and produced reports that reaffirmed existing practices. By the time conclusions were reached, urgency had dissipated. Time became a tool of control. A few individuals attempted to go further. One physician reportedly refused to continue certain procedures, citing harm to the children. His objections were documented, and then neutralized. He was reassigned, his role diminished. Another staff member attempted to keep personal notes on children's emotional states, only to be told such observations were unscientific. These were not dramatic punishments, but they were effective. Dissent learned to stay quiet. The most dangerous threat to the society came not from critics, but from inconsistency. Others were summarized, their most troubling details softened or omitted. What could not be erased was buried under layers of administrative order. For the institutions that had supplied children, hospitals, orphanages, reform schools, there was little incentive to reflect. Acknowledging their role would have implicated them as well. Instead, they adopted the language of reform and moved on. New generations of staff inherited systems whose origins were never fully explained. Institutional memory became selective. The greatest absence in this aftermath was acknowledgement. There were no official apologies to the children or their families. No public statements recognizing suffering. Silence was maintained under the guise of closure. To speak too openly, it was feared, would reopen wounds, undermine trust, and destabilize authority. Forgetting was framed as a form of healing. For survivors, this silence was devastating. Those who had lived through the experiments carried their experiences into adulthood with no validation. As results failed to match promises, confidence wavered. If the methods truly worked, why did so many children decline? Why did so few show lasting improvement after release? These questions haunted internal discussions, even as official narratives remained optimistic. Yet even as doubt grew, the machinery continued. Experiments did not stop. Procedures were not reversed. Instead, the society doubled down, convinced that refinement, not restraint, was the answer. Failures were treated as opportunities for deeper intervention. The possibility that the entire premise was flawed remained unthinkable. What ultimately destabilized the silence was accumulation. No single death, complaint, or critique was enough to force confrontation. But together, they formed a weight that could not be entirely ignored. Files thickened. Explanations grew longer. Justifications became more elaborate. The effort required to maintain innocence increased. For the children still inside the system, these internal struggles offered no relief. Their daily reality remained unchanged. If anything, tension within the institution made conditions worse. Staff under pressure became stricter. Protocols were enforced more rigidly. Compassion was seen as risk. The tragedy of this phase lies in how close the society came to self-awareness, and how decisively it turned away. The evidence was there. The harm was visible to those willing to see it. But acknowledging it would have required dismantling not just methods, but identity. It would have meant admitting that years of work, pride, and authority were built on suffering. Instead, the society chose preservation over truth, silence over accountability, and in doing so, It ensured that when exposure finally came, it would arrive not as reform, but as reckoning. Exposure did not arrive like a thunderclap. There was no single document that shattered the silence, no dramatic confession that forced the doors open. Instead, the truth began to surface the way rot does in an old building, through small cracks, an odor no one could quite explain, a sense that something beneath the surface was deeply wrong. By the time the wider world began to notice, the damage had already been done. The first real breach came through paper, not people. A bundle of internal reports, never intended for public circulation, found their way into the hands of an academic journal editor outside Saxony. The documents were dry, technical, and written in the society's familiar language of restraint and precision. But to an outsider, the patterns were unmistakable. Repeated references to child subjects, escalating interventions, mortality figures that exceeded what could reasonably be attributed to illness alone. The editor did not publish the documents outright. Instead, he wrote cautiously, posing questions rather than accusations. Those questions were enough. Within months, similar concerns appeared in other scholarly circles. Footnotes became longer. Language became sharper. Researchers began citing certain Saxon practices as examples of ethical ambiguity. Still, names were avoided. No one wanted to provoke a direct confrontation with such a powerful network. But the implication was clear to anyone paying attention. Inside the society, alarm spread quickly. Emergency meetings were called. Members debated not whether mistakes had been made, but how the narrative should be controlled. The priority was containment. If scrutiny could be kept within academic channels, it could be managed. Public exposure, however, would be disastrous. Official responses emphasized misunderstanding. Critics, the society claimed, lacked proper context. Data was being misinterpreted. Procedures were being judged by inappropriate moral standards. The society positioned itself as a victim of sensationalism, even as it quietly began to restrict access to its archives. Requests for information were delayed or denied. Files were reorganized. Some were quietly removed. The state, when approached, hesitated. Many officials had long-standing relationships with society members. Careers were intertwined. A full investigation risked implicating not just a single organization, but an entire system of oversight. Committees were proposed. Jurisdiction was debated. Time passed. Meanwhile, families of former child subjects began to recognize fragments of their own experiences in the emerging discourse. What had once felt like isolated tragedies now appeared connected. Letters were written. Testimonies offered. But without centralized records, these voices struggled to gain traction. Memories alone carried little weight against institutional documentation. When inquiries were finally initiated, they were narrow in scope, focused on procedural compliance rather than ethical violation. The question was not, was this wrong, but were the correct protocols followed? This framing allowed investigators to criticize minor administrative failures while leaving the core practices intact. Responsibility dissolved into process. The society cooperated selectively. It provided summaries rather than raw data. It highlighted reforms already underway. It presented itself as responsive, evolving, and misunderstood. In public statements, children were described as beneficiaries of care, not victims of experimentation. Language softened. Terms were revised. The past was reframed as a necessary stage in progress. What is most striking is how quickly attention faded. New controversies emerged. Political priorities shifted. The initial shock dulled. Without dramatic trials or punishments, the story lacked a clear endpoint. There were no villains to condemn, no catharsis to be found. The society's name gradually disappeared from headlines, replaced by broader discussions of ethics and reform. Internally, consequences were minimal. A few senior members retired quietly. Others shifted focus to different areas of research. The society itself rebranded, merging with allied organizations under a new charter. Its history was condensed, sanitized, and archived. The children who had suffered were not mentioned. For those children, or those who survived into adulthood, the exposure brought little relief. There were no apologies, no reparations, no acknowledgement of harm. Their experiences remained unofficial, unverified. Some attempted to speak publicly, but their accounts were met with skepticism or pity rather than action. Trauma, without documentation, was easy to dismiss. This quiet absorption of scandal into bureaucracy is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the exposure. The truth emerged, but it did not transform the system. It was studied, debated, and ultimately filed away. Lessons were discussed in abstract terms, stripped of the human cost that had prompted them. And yet, something had changed. The exposure left a residue of unease. New ethical guidelines began to circulate. Committees on child welfare and research oversight were formed. Language around consent slowly evolved. These developments were presented as natural progress, rarely linked explicitly to past abuses. But they were, in many ways, responses to them. The society's experiments were not erased by exposure. They were absorbed into history's margins. Known, but not fully reckoned with. Remembered, but not named loudly enough to provoke lasting outrage. This is how institutions survive, not by denying everything, but by conceding just enough to move forward unchanged. The children remained absent from official memory. Their suffering became a footnote in discussions about methodology. Their lives were reduced once more, this time not to data, but to cautionary examples without faces. Exposure, in the end, did not bring justice. It brought closure for institutions, not for victims. And in that imbalance lies the final cruelty of the society's work. Even when the truth emerged, it emerged on terms that preserved power and erased pain. History would record that something went wrong in Saxony in the early years of the German Empire. But it would take much longer, and require far more courage, to say clearly who paid the price. When the attention finally drifted away and the inquiries lost momentum, what remained was not justice, but a carefully managed aftermath. The society did not collapse. It did not face public trials or sweeping condemnation. Instead, it adapted. Like many powerful institutions confronted with uncomfortable truths, it learned how to survive exposure without truly changing its foundations. The consequences that followed were uneven, muted, and deeply revealing. On paper, reforms were introduced. New guidelines emphasized caution, oversight, and responsibility. Language around care became more refined. Committees were established to review procedures involving children. These measures were presented as evidence that lessons had been learned. But in practice, they functioned more as insulation than accountability. They protected institutions from future criticism rather than addressing past harm. No member of the society was held criminally responsible for what had happened. This was justified by the standards of the time. The experiments, investigators argued, had not violated existing laws. Ethics, after all, were evolving. To judge the past by the moral frameworks of the present was deemed unreasonable. This argument proved remarkably effective. It shifted focus away from victims and toward abstraction. Harm became a philosophical issue rather than a lived reality. A few individuals faced professional consequences, but these were symbolic at best. Early retirements were framed as natural conclusions to distinguished careers. Reassignments were described as promotions or strategic moves. In some cases, criticism was recast as evidence of innovation, proof that these individuals had been operating at the controversial edge of progress. Their reputations, far from being destroyed, often emerged intact. The society itself underwent a quiet transformation. Its name changed. Its charter was revised. New leadership emphasized transparency and collaboration. Internally, records were reorganized. Certain documents were sealed indefinitely. Others were summarized, their most troubling details softened or omitted. What could not be erased was buried under layers of administrative order. For the institutions that had supplied children, hospitals, orphanages, reform schools, there was little incentive to reflect. Acknowledging their role would have implicated them as well. Instead, they adopted the language of reform and moved on. New generations of staff inherited systems whose origins were never fully explained. Institutional memory became selective. The greatest absence in this aftermath was acknowledgement. There were no official apologies to the children or their families. No public statements recognizing suffering. Silence was maintained under the guise of closure. To speak too openly, it was feared, would reopen wounds, undermine trust, and destabilize authority. Forgetting was framed as a form of healing. For survivors, this silence was devastating. Those who had lived through the experiments carried their experiences into adulthood with no validation. Physical impairments, psychological trauma, and disrupted lives were theirs alone to bear. When they sought recognition, they encountered disbelief or indifference. Without official records to corroborate their stories, they were easily dismissed as unreliable narrators of their own pasts. Some survivors attempted to piece together what had happened through fragments, memories, rumors, half-remembered names. Others avoided the past entirely, unable to reconcile their suffering with a society that refused to acknowledge it. The lack of justice compounded the original harm. It sent a clear message: their pain did not matter enough to be named. This absence of accountability had broader consequences. It reinforced a dangerous precedent, that institutions could cause profound harm and emerge largely unscathed. That authority, once established, could absorb scandal without surrendering power. This lesson did not go unnoticed by other organizations. It became part of the unspoken rulebook of governance: manage exposure, concede minimally, move forward. In academic circles, the Society's work continued to be cited, though often stripped of its context. Findings were incorporated into broader theories of development and behavior. The suffering behind the data was rarely mentioned. Knowledge extracted through questionable means was normalized, its origins fading as it circulated. This is how harm becomes legacy without acknowledgement. The state, too, benefited from this outcome. By avoiding direct confrontation, it preserved stability and continuity. There was no reckoning that might challenge the relationship between science and authority. No public debate that might empower citizens to question expertise. Order was maintained, even if justice was not. And yet, beneath this surface of resolution, something unresolved lingered. Ethical discourse began to shift, slowly but noticeably. New frameworks emerged that emphasized consent, protection, and vulnerability. These changes were often presented as natural evolution, but they were reactions, responses to histories like this one, even when unnamed. The tragedy is that these reforms came too late for those who needed them most. They protected future subjects while abandoning past victims. This temporal injustice is one of the cruelest aspects of the aftermath. Progress was built on suffering, and once built, it moved forward without looking back. What happened in Saxony did not end with exposure. It settled into the foundation of modern ethical systems as an unspoken caution. But caution without acknowledgement is incomplete. It teaches systems how to adapt, not how to atone. The Society's story closes not with punishment or redemption, but with continuation. Life went on. Institutions endured. The children faded from view. History recorded a moment of controversy, then turned the page. And in that turning lies the final injustice. When harm is absorbed without consequence, it becomes invisible. Not because it did not happen, but because remembering it would require admitting that progress was paid for with lives that were never considered equal. The legacy of what happened in Saxony did not announce itself with clarity or remorse. It did not arrive labeled as a warning, nor was it formally acknowledged as a turning point. Instead, it seeped quietly into the foundations of modern science, medicine, and ethics, present everywhere, named almost nowhere. The children who endured those experiments became invisible contributors to a future that would never recognize them. Their suffering transformed into abstract lessons rather than remembered lives. In the decades that followed, medicine continued to advance at extraordinary speed. New treatments emerged, new theories took hold, and research became increasingly institutionalized. On the surface, this appeared to be progress unburdened by the past. But beneath that surface, the influence of earlier abuses shaped the way questions were asked, rules were written, and boundaries were drawn. Ethical frameworks did not emerge spontaneously. They were reactions to accumulated harm. The idea that research required limits gained traction precisely because those limits had once been absent. Committees dedicated to oversight began appearing, tasked with reviewing studies involving human subjects. Children, in particular, were gradually reclassified, not as raw material for improvement, but as a protected group. This shift, however, was slow and uneven. Protection was often reactive, introduced only after scandals made denial impossible. What is unsettling is how familiar the reasoning from Saxony sounds even today. The language has changed, but the logic persists. We still hear arguments about the greater good, about necessary risk, about progress requiring sacrifice. The difference now is procedural rather than philosophical. Consent forms replace silence. Review boards replace informal authority. But systems remain vulnerable to the same moral shortcuts when outcomes are prioritized over individuals. Modern science often congratulates itself on having learned from the past, and in many ways, it has. Yet this confidence can itself be dangerous. When institutions believe they are ethical by design, vigilance fades. The belief that this could never happen again is often the first step toward repetition under a different name. The children of Saxony were not victims of ignorance alone. They were victims of certainty, of experts convinced they were right, of institutions convinced their goals justified their methods. That same certainty still exists wherever power concentrates and dissent is inconvenient. It exists whenever vulnerable populations are framed as opportunities rather than individuals. One of the most troubling aspects of the legacy is how knowledge extracted through harm continues to circulate. Data gathered under unethical conditions does not simply disappear. It is cited, built upon, absorbed into broader theories. Over time, its origins become obscure. The suffering that produced it is erased, leaving only conclusions behind. This raises an uncomfortable question. Can knowledge ever be separated from the way it was obtained? There is no consensus on this. Some argue that refusing to use such knowledge compounds tragedy by rendering suffering meaningless. Others argue that using it perpetuates injustice. The debate itself is part of the legacy, an unresolved tension between remembrance and utility. What is often missing from this discussion, however, are the voices of those who suffered. Their absence makes abstraction easier. Beyond science, the story echoes in social policy, education, and child welfare. The idea that children can be shaped, optimized, and corrected remains deeply ingrained. While intentions may now be framed as supportive rather than disciplinary, the risk of overreach persists. Whenever intervention ignores autonomy, whenever outcomes matter more than experience, the shadow of Saxony lingers. The legacy also reveals something uncomfortable about accountability. Systems tend to evolve without apologizing. They reform without confessing. They protect future subjects while abandoning past victims. This creates a moral imbalance. Progress moves forward, but justice remains behind. Survivors are left carrying histories that institutions have already archived and forgotten. In some cases, this silence is deliberate. Acknowledging past abuses risks undermining trust in present authority. It raises questions that institutions would rather not answer. And so, history is sanitized. Harm is reframed as mistake. Victims are transformed into lessons rather than people. Yet forgetting does not erase consequence. Trauma persists across generations. Families carry stories without official validation. Communities inherit distrust toward institutions that once claimed benevolence. These are not abstract effects, they are lived realities. The legacy of experimentation on children is not confined to textbooks. It is embedded in skepticism, fear, and fractured trust. There is also a broader cultural lesson here, one that extends beyond science entirely. Saxony's tragedy illustrates how easily societies can rationalize harm when it aligns with dominant values. Progress, efficiency, strength, these ideals can become weapons when detached from empathy. The more a society prizes results, the easier it becomes to overlook the cost. This is why the story still matters. Not because it is uniquely horrifying, but because it is disturbingly ordinary. There was no single villain. No moment where everyone knew they had crossed a line. Instead, there were small decisions, reinforced by structure and belief, that accumulated into atrocity. That pattern repeats whenever power is insulated from accountability. Modern ethics are often presented as safeguards, but safeguards only function when actively defended. They require memory. They require discomfort. They require the willingness to look backward even when moving forward feels easier. Without that willingness, ethics become procedural rather than moral. The children of Saxony did not die so that future generations could learn. They died because a society failed to protect them. Any lesson drawn afterward is incomplete unless it includes that truth. Legacy should not mean usefulness extracted from suffering. It should mean responsibility carried forward. Ultimately, the most unsettling aspect of this legacy is how close it remains. The distance between then and now is not as vast as we might like to believe. The same forces, ambition, authority, fear of weakness, faith in systems, are still with us. The question is not whether progress will continue, but whether compassion will keep pace. History does not repeat itself exactly. It adapts. And the only way to prevent repetition is to recognize patterns before they harden into systems. Saxony in 1871 is not just a chapter of the past. It is a mirror, one that forces us to ask not how such things happened then, but how easily they could happen again if we stop asking who pays the price.